Hi everyone, and welcome to Odd Ducklings, the podcast where we talk about neurodivergent careers, life and everything in between. But what does that actually mean? I think the main question that we are trying to answer with this podcast is, can neurodivergent people have a career? Can neurodivergent people accomplish their goals? And if so, how can they actually do that? It all kind of started for me when I got my own diagnosis. I was recently diagnosed with PMDD and later with ADHD. And we will dig more into that later because it is something that I want to represent in a more thorough way. But the point was that when I started looking online at what these diagnoses meant, I felt disabled. And to me, that was something that I was not willing to live with. And I understand that despite it being something that to me is rather a negative, to a lot of people this is actually a powerful statement. Because if they can say and talk about their disability, then maybe they can do something about it. And this brings me to the point of today's conversation, which is language and how we perceive it in different ways and how we can use it to our benefit. So our guest today, Rawi, he's going to tell a bit more about himself in just a minute. He immediately talked about not ignoring the people that don't have it as easy or haven't reached the place where we have, but we feel either we have accomplished enough or that we are strong enough or maybe just privileged enough to state our neurodiversity out loud and talk about it and, move on with it. And I think it's an important thing to be discussing. Is it a disability? What does it mean if it's a disability? And how do we talk about it? What does it actually mean to be neurodivergent? Are you neurodivergent? Do you know what neurodivergency is? It's actually something that came up quite a bit in the conversations that I've had. So in today's episode, I'm actually doing something a bit different, especially because I got a bit of a feedback regarding some things, and I wanted to touch on these points, especially on what is a neurodivergent, what it means, and what it means in a workspace. Because despite having a lot of stories regarding amazing achievements in previous episodes, we didn't always ask these questions. And specifically this time, it also really fit with the guest that we are having. So I want to hear from you after this episode. Again, all of this feedback, everything that I'm improving is because you guys are sending me feedback. So please keep doing that. I would love to improve things based on what you say and not based on my own thoughts. I'm going to be jumping into the episode in just a minute. I only want to stop on two very short things before we do. First thing is, have you noticed the music at the beginning? You'll also hear it at the end, and eventually there's a long version of it that will be coming on Instagram and anywhere else. This is actually our theme song, the theme song of Odd Ducklings. Have you heard the quack? I love the quack. Made by love of my life, Tomiraz. Yeah, it's incredible. Tell me if you like it. If you don't like it, I'm probably just going to keep it. Somebody wrote me a theme song. I'm keeping it. Sorry. That was the first thing. Second thing is, just FYIs, I'm starting to reach out to people and increase the team. I want to have more people on board so that we can build a community and have people help each other. I want to have more people on board so that we can create more content that would be more on point based on your feedbacks. I think with just me, it's a bit limited on my abilities, and I want to be able to spend more time on giving you more value rather than with the bureaucracy. So when we can share the bureaucracy and we can do all of that, that's going to be great. So if you are interested or if you know someone who's interested, reach out to me. I would love to have a conversation about this, have a coffee, see if this fits, and looking for at least 2 more people to come about and do this. I already have some people I'm talking to, so if you're interested, try and do this till mid-August. I think that should be fine. I don't know when you're listening to this. This might be way, way in the future, right? So mid-August 2024. Yeah. So now I'm going to take us into the conversation. And again, the structure is a bit different. The conversation is a bit different. We're not necessarily going into the lows of things. We're exploring the subject a bit more thoroughly this time. I hope you like it. Let me know if you have a preference between these types of conversations that we can have, and what did you find more valuable. All right, let's get started. Hey, Rawi. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get started, tell us a bit about yourself. We're going to discuss today a bit more about the language of being neurodivergent or ADHD and how you as a coach handle this. But before we start, give us a bit of an introduction. What should we know about you?
Hi, my name is Rawi. I am a ADHD and product management coach. I am a Thai, Chinese, and South Asian male, about 6'5" or 198 centimeters to you in other places.
To all of you metric system people.
Yeah. Um, and I have short black hair and brown skin. I'm also a former accessibility product manager. So accessibility, both in digital space and physical spaces, is something important to me. And I'm a former autism researcher and professional kickboxer and professional photographer. I have ADHD. I've had like 13 careers. I'm excited to be here and share my stories.
Amazing. All right. So let's get started.
I think that where we can start is just like with the term neurodivergent, right? And kind of still recognizing that in the case of ADHD and autism specifically, they are disabilities. And the reason why I want to bring that up is that oftentimes when we use these types of terms like neurodivergent, neurodiverse, we end up marginalizing the most severe of us, right? So it's a positive story to say that yes, I have ADHD and I can still have a fulfilling career, but there are also many of us that have much more severe symptoms in addition to additional disorders, right? That aren't able to have regular jobs. I worked in a hospital seeing some of the most severe cases of autism. I also have a business partner with autism, but my business partner is far his severity of his disorder is far away from those. So I want to acknowledge that when we say it's a disability, some people may say like, no, it's just a way of different thinking. Yes, but also when we just focus on that, we forget some of the most hardest hit of us, and I think that's really important.
Okay. So honestly, you started from one of the most painful points for me because I was diagnosed with PMDD, right? The next few episodes that I will be having will probably be more about PMDD, and we talked about this. And for me, one of the worst things that came is that when I got the diagnosis and I knew that I was a capable person, but I saw the conversation around the diagnosis, it sounded like a disability. It didn't only sound, right? Like a lot of people do get the disability sign off for having PMDD. But I also felt like, yes, it can be a disability, but I can also find a way to work with it and around it to make it less so, because I think we all have problems, right? Even the neurotypical people, everybody has something going on. I do not for one second want to kind of like play down people experiencing autism in an extreme way. My father is actually now volunteering after he retired with a lot of these people, and the stories of some of these children, 16, 18, that cannot really go into society and really function because they have autism and they just don't know how to communicate with so many things that seem to me normal. So I don't want to play down that part. I'm completely in agreement with you that it exists, but we have a different spectrum. Actually, with ADHD, we don't speak as much about how much of a disability it is, right? So many people that get diagnosed with ADHD, usually the idea of superpower is something that's been super hyped lately, right? People really like, oh, you have ADHD, so you can hyper-focus and you're super energetic, so you're going to be super cool in the company or something. So I do like that you brought it up. I want to put the other side of this coin, right? Because only talking about the pains also brings us to the point that we feel like we can't do something. And that, to the core of it, this is what brought about this podcast. I want to talk about how our greatest pains still didn't stop us or even helped us in some way reach our goals. I want to do that so that people that haven't reached that point yet might hear you and say, oh, Rawi did this and maybe I can try, right?
Yeah, and for me, like to kind of continue that is the importance of language, right? And language as a way to describe your symptoms, describe what you need, describe to providers what are your symptoms, right? If someone says I worry a lot because I have anxiety versus I worry a lot because I have ADHD, those are two different medication, like frontline medications typically, right? And so I think what you're um, striving for yes, like I'm completely aligned with that. I think we can help people get there by understanding more of the language, right? So it's less so about the action, in my opinion. Like I can tell you things that I've done, but I don't live the life of that person. So I think the knowledge I can pass on is how do I cultivate the language and also self-awareness to describe that. It could be through learning words about my different emotions. It could be learning more about what disorder that I have, what the stages of autism are, which have changed since when I was an autism researcher, right? So yeah, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. To me, it's language is the way that you're able to both empower, but and discriminate, right? So if someone says, "Oh, you're neurodiverse," I'm automatically going to think you're not a good person or not a good worker. Like it can
Yeah.
harm us as well.
With that, I'm going to bring the ball back to you. If you had to define a neurodivergent, what does it mean? Because I actually got a lot of people. I actually went to visit my company a week ago, and people asked me like, "What's neurodivergent?" And apparently, it's a question that many people don't know the answer to. And when you actually Google it, the answer is, well, it differs. As someone who's done the research, as someone who lives it and works with neurodivergent people, how would you define it?
I don't know the original origin, but I'll tell you my story of how I came to be with the word, why I use the word, um, and what things I've learned. The word just kind of came up. Like I've been in the disability space, um, since 2008 when I was a researcher, and then I stopped being a researcher in 2011. And so I kind of left the autism space, went in to be a kickboxing researcher, then got into tech, and then I was diagnosed with ADHD about 3 years ago. And the term neurodivergence is something relatively new to me. I would say probably in the last 2 years. Um, the other fun one I like is neurospicy. I
Love it
don't
too.
I don't know where it came from. I'm just using it. But I recently was posting in the Reddit ADHD group, and the subreddit for ADHD is one of the largest. I think I have hundreds of thousands of users, and a post of mine got blocked because of using the word neurodivergent. And I was surprised because I read the little thing there. It said, "Hey, like this word was given to us by the neurotypical community," which I didn't know, and I don't know the history, but according to their bot, like we don't use that word. Instead, we state the disorder that we have. So we try to focus on clarity instead. So we we say that we have ADHD. We don't say that we have neurodivergence in order to have a more clear conversation.
What do you make of it?
The first word I thought of was the N word, right? So a lot of discriminatory history towards it. However, it is a word that's been taken back by that community, by certain people of that community, right? Like you hear it in pop music, you see it in movies, right? It is a word that people of this community, certain people, have chosen to make part of their daily life. It could be for empowerment, it could be for fun, whatever reasons that they have, right? But they've taken ownership of that, and hopefully, most of us in the world respect that. And I see that same kind of learning for myself to the term neurodivergent of if it's a word that I'm comfortable with, if it's a word that other people that I talk with feel safer using, then I think it works. And I'll give you a context for work in terms of safety. If someone says I'm neurodiverse in a work context, neurodiverse could mean someone who has just generalized anxiety, ADHD, or autism. You kind of can hide a little bit behind this because someone could, like, you could have a temporary state of being neurodiverse, right, due to uh, hormonal changes, right, or whatever it could be. Pregnancy is a good example where you can have like a change of state of mind. And so I look at it in a way of there's this community of neurodiverse people. If people want to identify with it, great, use the word. But I also recognize the safety component to it.
Okay. But from what I hear from you, I think it's also hard for you to kind of put the finger on, like, what is the definition of a neurodivergent?
So my response would be, what does that person need? Right. So how did they identify? So if we use again another community, so the LGBTQIA, right, we're using pronouns. Like, how do you identify as pronoun? If someone says they use X pronoun, I don't need to probe further unless there's some reason. And so for me, if someone says they're neurodivergent, like, oh, cool, I am too. It sets that stage to be safer, and then to say, like, what's next, right? So like in our conversation, we're both neurodivergent. You're asking me what it means to me. Really, it's more important to me to know what it means to you in order to set the boundaries for this conversation, the boundaries for what I can ask you or what I should know about you. Because if you're saying, like, oh, neurodivergent, and I say, well, what do you have? If you meet someone who you don't feel safe with, you can you back off. But if you meet someone who you do want to describe it to, you can. So it's less important to me what my meaning is, and more important to me to learn what that other person wants me to know in that setting.
So we're back again to the idea of giving this word meaning by asking the other person in a conversation. In this case, you and I, that would be me. But in any other conversation, like with the Reddit conversation that you've just mentioned, listening to what they say, and they say, we're not comfortable with this word. And then what do you do with this? Because we talk about the power of language in a world where trends is something that, as the internet became more sparse and so big, became very local, very small, and very fast. And it happens quite a bit with words and how we pronounce things. And the new generation, right, they have these slangs that they use in certain parts of the world and in others, and they don't always kind of correspond. If you're not on TikTok, you might not be aware of something that's like devastating somebody else's world. And then you and I, we live in a certain ecosystem because we both work in like tech companies and like all of that. And you go into somewhere that's a bit more big, right? Like Reddit. How do you use language without hurting somebody if you don't know what the trend is? How do you use it well?
There's two things I can think of there. One, like, now we're kind of moving into really a discussion of disclosure. So disclosure being defined as telling someone else about yourself, really. If we say that we're neurodiverse, we are disclosing a certain amount of ourselves. Disclose. If I join a Slack channel that is an employee resource group for neurodiverse people, in a way, I'm disclosing to others that I am either part of this group or I closely identify with the group. Mm-hmm. And we make these decisions every day as a person with neurodiversity. If you're, again, part of the LGBTQIA community, when someone asks you your pronoun, you are making a disclosure. Like when I say, or even if you're not, when I say I'm making that I use pronouns of he, him, I'm making a disclosure about myself. To your question about like how we not hurt each other, I got this advice from my adopted trans sister. And the way that I introduce myself on all calls is, hi, my name is Rawi. You can pronounce it like Maui with an R. I use the pronouns he, him. How may I address you? And by stating this information, it creates the invitation for the other person to feel safe if they would like to disclose that about themselves. So really it's not so much about, hey, like, how do I use the right words with you? It's about having the courage to use the words that you want to use for yourself and creating an invitation for them to share what they need in that conversation or how they want to express themselves.
I love that you mentioned this. You started a conversation this way. And at first I didn't fully hear the entire thing, and I asked you and you said the same thing again. And I remember for me, the first response was a bit of a shock because I didn't know what could I say on my end, because for me, I fully respect people who have their own pronouns, and of course I use them to the best of my memory. I don't always remember, then I apologize. Obviously, if somebody's asking you to approach them or treat them a certain way, there's absolutely no reason or themselves or anyone around them for you to do anything about this, right? Like, other than listen to them and do what they asked. But I didn't know how I should respond in this situation. And I'm not saying it for like good or bad, but I wonder, have you had other situations talking to people outside of the United States where you felt like the response was different culturally?
I will tell you from my experience of coaching people from all around the world, just meeting strangers on a pretty regular basis, that there have been 2 instances now where I said that, and the other person was so caught off guard that they were actually more open. Because they lived in a country where expressing their queerness was a danger to them. So by saying this right off the bat, like I saw them, like that was the power. Like in that first sentence, they felt seen. And the conversation and the tone, like they thanked me, like the mask came off immediately, right? To me, those 2 instances, even if I make someone uncomfortable, any other misses, those 2 instances make it worth it. If I can help someone feel more seen 1% of the time, I'm gonna do it.
I'm out. Actually, you convinced me. This has been something that I've been, running in my head back and forth, because I just don't see it as something that I find value in. But this is absolutely true. If you can get one person to get value out of this, right? To an extent, this is also what I'm saying about the podcast. If I can get one person to use something from the podcast, then it's a success. And this is so much simpler than making the podcast. This is just like, adding, like, this is a safe space. You're right. I completely agree.
Ultimately, everything adds up to a desire for all of us to be seen, regardless if you're neurodivergent or not. All of us, I believe, have a desire to be seen by ourselves, be seen by others. And there are these little things that we can do with our language that can do that, with others and ourselves. I do a lot of, I have my like daily startup mantra of what I tell myself before I start my day, because I struggle with my own anxiety and my own self-loathing, right? And I try to create the space for others to do the same. And for me, like one of the things I learned from my ADHD coach was the power of an invitation. And the power of saying, what that invitation, like that intro, like, hey, my name is, I use the pronouns, like that is ultimately an invitation that helps someone else be seen.
Okay. We started this conversation with neurodiversity and neurodivergency, right? Mm-hmm. But you don't come in a room and you say, hi, I have ADHD, or I'm neurodivergent. And I wonder if that would be, if you think that's actually the right way to, move forward with having this conversation in a more open way and opening the room for others?
That is a personal decision, and this is something
Of course.
I've worked with a lot of different people with, is that the disclosure is not a solution in itself. A disclosure in the US or in Europe in a workplace setting might get you certain rights. However, the disclosure, if we look at an individual level, the disclosure needs to be followed up with what is the need that you're asking for, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I use the example, hey, I'm hungry.
Then I would know what you need. You need food, right?
Right. But then your next question, like, well, what would you like to eat? And for most of us, unfortunately, if I say I have ADHD, the next person is, well, what do you need? Most people aren't able to articulate what they need. Most people haven't been exposed to common accommodation strategies. Most people haven't had access to a psychiatrist, a therapist, or a coach to learn about their own way of how they process things and need things.
Whose responsibility would it be in a workspace setting? Do you think it would be the responsibility of the employer or the employee to build these alignments?
It depends on the context. And so again, if you use the example of I'm hungry, right? If you're the person with the food and I'm the person that needs the food, it goes back and forth because you need to know what I need to eat. I need to know what you have to serve, right? So in the context of an employer, it begins with you typically. And I say typically because there are extreme cases. If you're being a victim of active discrimination and you have to disclose or invoke the ADA, which, by the way, you do not have to disclose your full diagnosis to make it a disclosure. You just have to say, I have a disability. That is another common misconception I just want to clear out. Like, you don't have to say, like, I have ADHD, protect me. You just say, like, I have a disability. That is same for the US, same for Europe, under my understanding.
That makes sense, and it's a very good point. Yeah.
But your question, like, who's the onus on it? The best source is you. However, it takes a lot of work, right? You might not have access to those things. You might not have access to healthcare or therapists and all these things. And so, someone who's listening to this right now is like, I'm dealing with this at work right now. I would focus less on the disclosure component and focus more about what is it about the situation or the environment I need changed. So for example, I am a morning person. I get up at 5:30. I go for a run. For me, my ideal time to deal with tough stuff is between 8 a.m. and noon.
That's my worst time. But I'm a bit jealous, I have to admit, because for me, the morning is the worst time. Like, I try to get up by 8 or like 7 when I'm really good with myself, but 5 a.m. and then I think I'm really happy about working in tech because usually they start working at about 10 and that really aligns with my ability to get up. But so that's kind of cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a great call out. So there's something called delayed sleep syndrome that is common with folks with ADHD and neurodiversity. And that essentially means that your sleep cycle is off the normal. Like, sunrise is when you get up, sundown is when you go to bed. Right? So I have friends who their peak time is 3 p.m. Between 3 and 6 p.m., that is like their most focused time. So it's doing things like that. So notating for yourself, right, where you say, like, hey, the morning time is worse for me. This is my ideal time frame. And then prioritizing your tasks. So for example, for myself, my one-on-ones and like this podcast are in the morning. Right? Like, I'm doing this when I have the most medication in my system, the most endorphins from exercise, and food in my belly. So at work, I do my hard things there. That's when I do my doc writing. That's when I do my one-on-ones. I falter in the afternoon, And so I move my easier tasks there. Right? And so that asking your manager or whoever you're having a meeting with, like, hey, can I have this in the morning? Can I have my regular meeting for XYZ in the morning? That doesn't require disclosure, right? That is just asking. And it also invites the other person. So if you were to say, hey, I'm a morning person, I'd like to do this thing in the morning, and invites the other person to say what they want. So they might say,
Okay.
I'm more of an afternoon person. It's like, well, can we split the difference? Can we do 11 a.m.? Awesome. When we are able to cultivate the self-awareness of what we need, and we have the courage to share with others, we invite others to do the same in order to get to a mutually agreeable path.
Mm.
Right?
Okay.
It's a lot
Yeah.
more work than you think, right? Because I just described
It's so much
self-awareness.
work.
Yeah, self-awareness, courage, and invitation. But
Mm-hmm.
the output or the outcome is being seen, right? It's having your accommodation met,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if I were to tell my boss, like, hey, you're going to get the best out of me if you meet with me at 9 a.m., they're probably going to do that because they want my best, right?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and if going back to the analogy for food, if you say, hey, I'm hungry, what do you want to eat? And I say, well, what are you best at? And it's like, oh, I'm my best cooking style is what is your favorite cuisine to cook?
I don't know, Asian.
Yeah, I'm probably going to ask you for something Asian,
Okay,
right?
that
Right?
makes sense. Yeah. So if we're focusing today and we're focusing about how we use language
Mm-hmm.
to basically convey all of these things, and when we're coming to the work environment with this interest and not having what I feel is shame to an extent by not talking about some diagnosis, how would you go about talking about your, so let me take you a bit backwards. How did you do this in your work environment? What did you do that you felt was right or wrong?
With how I chose to disclose. I was diagnosed 3 years ago. I disclosed to my manager because I have ADHD and I'm just hyper honest. It's just part of me. But I disclosed on LinkedIn and I'm public with my diagnosis after considering the dynamics of power. And those are I'm 198 centimeters tall, a former professional kickboxer, a former Amazon PM, a former neuroscience researcher. I have a lot of power and expertise that others may not. And so the decision of, hey, do I tell people about this came from, I believe I have enough power to overcome any adversity that might come as a result of this. And for me, that was important because it helped me to start learning the language of how to describe that. And so that began my journey of hey, I told my boss I have ADHD. And they're like, oh, yeah, me too. And now what? Right. And they were amazing. He remains one of the best managers I've ever had in my life because what he did really well were the things I faltered, and I didn't even realize it at the time. He was able to steer me back on to the context of what I needed to get done. And
Mm-hmm.
so there were times I had to get stuff done, but he did his best to find those places and not stick me with the things I didn't want to do. But at the same time, where I had to learn was how do I develop the language when I do struggle? I got some negative feedback this week, and because I've been struggling with some stuff, um, I use the language of asking my manager, "Hey, what do you think of this?" And I'm lucky enough. Again, I have one of the best managers in the world right now, where she gave me feedback in a very kind and actionable way. I engaged with that feedback. So I had to tell everything about myself, and this is a mantra I can share, is I had the courage to listen. I looked at that Slack message. It was long. I'd give myself a deep breath, and I had the courage to listen. And then respond with hey, you're right. And my response was, I've been feeling a lot of anxiety about these projects. What you're pointing out, I think, is why. how do I move forward with this now? What is your advice? What do you need for me to meet the expectations that you have? What I needed to take action on it.
My assumption is that one of the greatest challenges in this case would have been emotional regulation, because as you said, you felt very strongly about this. And you mentioned before having or not having the tools, be it like getting therapy or an ADHD coach or anything of that sort. I know to what extent you went through any of these, but what was the process that got you from having less control to reaching this point where you can say, give me the feedback, read through it, and manage this emotional chaos? Because we all have this, like, I dropped a cup and suddenly I'm worthless, right? And this is more than a cup.
Yeah. So the first, for me, the foundation, this is my personal mental model of ADHD. I believe that ADHD is an emotional regulation disorder in which the byproducts are attention and focus. Now, emotional regulation is made up of two components. There is the mind, which is our lived experience, how we were taught to regulate emotion, our active thoughts learned from trauma and happiness and all those things, but also the neurobiology that underpins that. And I make that distinction because I think oftentimes when we think of emotions, we believe falsely that we are fully in control, right? And we believe that, oh, I shouldn't be upset about, or I shouldn't get emotional about feedback at work. Right? I don't know if a boss has ever told you about that, but I've been told that before. Like, oh, don't get emotional about it.
I guess they didn't straightforward tell me, but I would get this look like, I see it like in the back of their head. It's like, are you overreacting there?
Yeah, and so using that mental model, which, by the way, in the US DSM criteria, emotional regulation is not a criteria for ADHD. It is in the European diagnosis standards.
Oh.
And I say this to as many people as I can because there is a movement to add it to the DSM-6 whenever that comes out. And so this emotional regulation connects things, also covers like rejection sensitivity dysphoria, right? The sensation that when we're told no or when we fail, like, it's an exaggerated experience. Recognizing that my emotional reaction is going to oftentimes be improportional to the event helps me cultivate the self-awareness to decide what to do in that moment. So going back to the manager example, I was nervous. I saw the feedback. Everything about me was telling me to run. My default is to quit my job. I think about quitting all three of my two of my companies and my job all the time. But I reminded myself I have the courage to listen, which wasn't from me, by the way. This is a quote from Brene Brown, a very well-known author and shame researcher. And so I had the self-awareness to make that decision. And so for me, working with coaches, like working as a coach and just anyone, it's really about how do I process that event and then make the decision, and what are the tools to now make that decision. So in this case, the tool was I have the courage to listen. Now I'm going to respond with empathy. I'm going to respond by acknowledging that this person took the time and assuming that they care based on my previous interactions, and say, screw it to the fear and dove in. And I feel much better about it.
I like your sentence of they care, and of course, basing it on your knowledge. Something I often say more about personal relationships, but I think now that you've said it, I kind of agree that it should also apply when it comes to, professional relationships, is assume good intentions. Like, assume the other side doesn't say whatever they say to hurt you. And it's not necessarily true, but it also, like, even if it was their intention, if you react like it wasn't, a lot of time it diffuses the anger and it keeps the conversation going in the right way, right? And in professional situations, I may have used it accidentally. But, especially when it comes to like personal connections, sometimes you get a lot more emotional when it's someone, who's really dear to you or something like that. And you hear them say something that hurts for some reason. And if you assume they didn't mean to hurt you, you might think, oh, so what did they mean? And can I learn from it? And can I improve? So I love that.
We've talked a lot about disclosure. We've talked a lot about language, right? But really, we start off with, how do I make the decision in the moment, right? How do I react to this event with my emotions? And this is something I got from Reddit that I really like, that your feelings are your feelings, so validate and accept them, but feelings aren't facts. Right?
Mm-hmm.
You choose what you want to do. And I like that framework, because oftentimes with ADHD or autism, you spend so much of your energy keeping your shit together. And so I have to spend energy to tell myself Daria likes me. That is an emotional cost, right?
Yeah.
But I can acknowledge, well, my feeling that she doesn't like me may not be real. So instead, I'm going to choose, say, I think she likes me. So again, for you listeners out there, acknowledge your emotions. Your feelings are your feelings. Acknowledge them. Feelings aren't facts. You decide what to do next. The other parts about disclosure and language, you will learn more about them as you develop that first framework, because they give you the tools to make that decision, right? So they don't really come in until the very end of, how do you act? What words do you say? How do you respond? It's really about, how do I allow myself to process this and separate what I'm feeling with what I think is going on.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I love it. It's
that would be everything.
So
That's
easy
how I
as said
encapsulate
than
it.
done. Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great summary. Yeah. So thank you so much for this. This has been amazing. Before we leave, I'm going to give the floor to you to recommend anything that you like to share, like any book that you really liked and you feel like would be very useful. And on top of everything, as a coach, tell us a bit more about what you can give us or anything else you want to tell us about.
Yeah. So my two favorite books. One was a book in a YouTube channel, is How to ADHD by Jess McCabe. She's probably one of the most well-known ADHD YouTubers out there.
Yeah.
And the other book that I've recently read that was really powerful for me was Dare to Lead by Brene Brown. It's an older leadership book that she wrote, but for me, what was really effective about it was kind of controlling, like managing my shame and managing being vulnerable in the face of uncertainty constantly. And that's what you're doing when you're disclosing. That's what you're doing when you're a neurodiverse person, is you're constantly taking a leap, even though everything in your head is saying, don't do it, you're going to fail, right? Yeah. So that is one of my favorite books. It also discusses how to find your values. She has another book called Atlas of the Heart, in which is like a dictionary of emotions. Again, another great book to describe like how you're feeling and what that means from a scientific sense, and how you can communicate that with others. As for me, I'm an ADHD and product management coach, is how I bill myself. I am a product manager and a former autism and attention researcher. I didn't know I had ADHD at the time when I was a researcher. I saw everyone else around me did, and I thought I was the normal person. I was wrong. That's why I fit in with everyone.
Everybody around me is crazy, and I'm the only one that's that's incredible.
But I got along with everyone really well, so it explains why I fit in. I also have my practice has recently expanded. We also have a therapist on staff and a former VP, where we help minorities and marginalized groups, especially in tech, to help them thrive better.
I just wanted to add that this is an incredible goal, and very proud to have you here with us. That's amazing.
And we provide one-on-one coaching and also business services. So if you have an HR department, an L&D department, that is trying to learn how to better accommodate their neurodiverse employees. And you can find me on my blog, ADHDproduct.com or ADHDpm.substack.com. I write every week. If you want to hear me more talk about random subjects about ADHD and tech, that's where you can find me.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Of course, we will link everything below so you guys don't have to, start typing. Just going to be there. And Rawi, thank you very, very much. Goodbye, everyone. Stay odd.
Bye, everyone.